Basically, I'm going to focus on the role of finance on boosting agri-food system resilience, which is a very important element of the systems, of the agri-food systems. Let me first start by explaining what we mean by agri-food systems. When we talk about agriculture, we need to understand that what is being produced is not only for food. Of course, there is a major role of agriculture to produce food, but there is also a major role of agriculture to produce other elements which are not food related, like, for example, fibers and biofuels and many other types of products like forestry. So we need to take into account both, because both are the ones that will create incomes to farmers and to rural areas. Fulfilling the 2030 agenda depends crucially on progress in rural areas, which is where most of the poor and hungry live, and sustainable and equitable agri-food systems are crucial to eradicate hunger. And that's something that we need to take into account. If we want to reduce poverty, we want to promote healthy diets, we want to contribute to the One Health, and we want to reduce inequalities and have decent employment, and especially environmental sustainability, we need to focus on agriculture, and therefore we need to focus in rural areas. As highlighted in the Food Finance Architecture report, it's very important that today's food systems, because it generates around 12 trillion in hidden social, economic, and environmental costs each year. And despite the increase in productivity, food system priorities largely favor volume over nutrition and are environmentally unsustainable and continue to leave significant parts of the food system behind. The state of food security and nutrition in the world, published by FAO with all the UN partners, highlights that between 720 and 811 million people in the world face hunger, while around 3 billion people lack access to healthy diets. Agriculture and food systems contribute significantly to climate change. The livestock sector alone is estimated to be responsible for 14.5% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And land use changes and deforestation are driving biodiversity loss, while intense import pollution is harming the integrity of both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. The majority of the world's poorest reside in rural areas, facing persistent spatial, social, economic, and political inequalities, which can reinforce power imbalances that reduce their participation in and their contribution to the agri-food systems. In addition, the agri-food systems are facing important shocks. The consequence of COVID-19 pandemic and the associated migration and mitigation measures create significant problems, and also extreme weather and climate change. And today we're also facing a significant challenge because of the Ukraine war with Russian Federation. Now, reinforcing and driving these outcomes is the fact that agri-food systems are significantly underfinanced. In many countries, but particularly in developing countries, the small-scale producers and actors along the agri-food value chains face extremely difficulties in accessing finance, remaining significantly underfunded, and therefore they don't have the liquidity. And I assume today, where the cost of inputs are increasing so much, like fertilizers, it is even more difficult for farmers to be able to continue producing with the same level of yields. Small-scale producers' access to finance and other services is crucial to improve access to food, relaxing liquidity restrictions, and enabling them to invest in their livelihoods and well-being. Yet, it is estimated that 80% of the finance demand for smallholder producers is unmet. In sub-Saharan Africa, 3 out of 4 agri-SMEs lack sufficient access to finance. This problem is especially severe for women, youth, and other disadvantaged groups who already face challenges to accessing finance due to persistent social and economic exclusion. In Nigeria, for example, there is a gap of 24% between men and women access to finance. Imagine if the land titles are not with the name of both the male and the female, then they don't have a collateral. Even more, if they do contract farming arrangements, they won't be able to get the benefits because the arrangement will be done with the male. So again, these gender gaps are extremely important, are linked also to ownership of assets and to institutional innovations that need to be put in place to reduce these inequalities. Where finance is available, numerous studies point to the inadequacy and inefficiency of current support to agriculture. Agricultural subsidies have historically been used as a tool to increase production and productivity, with a focus on ensuring food security. Such a support has generated trade distortions that negatively affect the developing countries. Agricultural subsidies have also been linked to overuse of natural resources and unsustainable production and have constrained the shift towards greener practices. Most green finance to the sector is short-term, while long-term financing is required for investments and for matching the length of the ecological transition that is required. For example, despite compelling need to scale up green investments and climate-smart practices, access to green and sustainable finance has proven difficult. Currently, only 1.7% of the global climate finance goes to the smallholder farmers, despite of them being particularly exposed to vulnerable to the effect of climate change for their livelihoods. So all these inconsistencies needs to be changed, and we need to change and align properly the incentives. That's why we work on this repurposing of subsidies, and the study we have done with UNDP, and also the World Bank is doing similar work. Transforming food systems to deliver healthy, nutritious diets shift towards nature-positive production, because we know that healthy diets will reduce the level of emissions and also deliver more equitable outcomes that will require significant financial investments, which are estimated between 300 and 400 billion of additional investment per year. Meeting this financial gap will require action on several fronts, notably repurposing current agricultural subsidies, as I mentioned before, and meeting the funding gap through diverse strategies. The joint FAO UNDP UNEP report, A Multi-Billion-Dollar Opportunity, highlights that subsidies in the form of producer support accounts for almost $540 billion a year, or 15% of the total agricultural production value. Under a continuation of the current trends, this support could reach almost $1.8 trillion in 2030. It will be imperative to reorient government expenditures for food systems toward the types of subsidies, public goods, and services which will increase efficiency, equity, and contribute to adaptation to a mitigation of climate change, promote soils, health, and biological diversity. We need to increase efficiencies, and that's where these resources should be oriented. Like, for example, in the case of soils, we need to increase efficiency in the presence of soil maps in the world. In addition, shifting towards more multisectoral approaches, for example, those that combine social protection with climate-smart and nutrition-sensitive agricultural agendas, can facilitate sustainable transitions for producers and consumers alike. Public finance also has an important role to play in the provision of guarantees and insurance as instruments for managing risk and attracting the investments in agricultural food systems. Insurance in the world and the agricultural insurance in the world are highly subsidized. But developing countries and poor economies don't have that capacity. But at the same time, they don't have the information for reinsurance companies to measure the loss function. As a result of that, reinsurance costs are too high, as was shown by Michael Carter. So we need to find ways in which we can improve this, and this is a public good. We need to improve the information, and Mexico is an example, how they move from a highly subsidized scheme to a more competitive and market-oriented scheme of insurance that help also to access to finance, because when a request of a finance loan comes from a farmer that is already insured, it will reduce the risk, and it will, of course, facilitate access to this financial mechanism. Now, reorienting existing subsidies must be complemented by effective strategies to expand domestic public sources. Fiscal policies, including the progressive taxation, will be key to ensure public resources are strengthened. In many emerging economies, high financial and economic stress may result in limited means, highlighting the need to mobilize external multilateral support to ensure business and livelihood support, which is reaching those in need. In recent years, the possibility of using public and development finance catalytically to mobilize commercial capital for investment in the agri-food sector is receiving growing interest. Blended finance can play a role in improving risk-return ratios to create commercially viable investment opportunities for private actors. But it's important to understand that if we are going to put blending finance to facilitate the private sector operation, this needs to be competitive so that we realize the real information and needs in the market. And this could be a very successful approach. It has worked before in the telecommunications sector in rural areas. So we need to find ways in which we can create the information set for companies to compete for the minimum blending required to be able to do their investments. So it's not just a flat blending mechanism. Technical assistance is also a critical contributor to success or failure of blended solutions. Developing bankable projects, reducing operational risks, and creating a conducive context in terms of policy and regulatory environment have been essential aspects. But again, we are not there to build up the details of the project. We are there to put the parameters of the investments that are required. For example, cooling facilities to increase resilience and to reduce food losses. The technology will come from the private sector. We'll just put the minimum requirements that are needed so that then they can compete for this blending finance. It will be fundamental to address inequalities in access to public finance and investment. Historically, the agricultural sector has faced important challenges to invest due to high risk and potentially low returns. Small-scale actors faced even higher barriers to accessing investments and loans, as they often face limited access to financial services. Banks or many have challenges related to bankability or asset ownership. As I mentioned before, women and youth, for example, are less likely to legally hold assets, have less power in household decision-making, and less likely to receive training and financial management. Let me come back with a story of a project that I implemented. We were testing how we can increase access to finance for mango producers in northern Peru. When we approached the financial system, they were very reluctant to take the risk because they didn't know the sector. So what we did is we created a revolving fund with the support of some donors. This revolving fund, the only thing that did was to de-risk the risk that these banks had on giving loans to these farmers. Essentially, if a farmer didn't pay, a percentage of the loss will be covered by this revolving fund. What we found at the end is that when these farmers got access to credit, automatically they were very compliant in the repayments. And the revolving fund increased over time, and this banking system in this rural area, they start to understand the different risks and how farmers manage those risks. And the revolving fund was able to perdure over time. So yes, there was a city investment, a small subsidy, a small blending, but this could then became very commercially viable and sustainable over time. The stakeholders will also need to mobilize private finance towards sustainable inclusive outcomes and will require both fiscal policies, incentives and disincentives, regulation, border measures, credit market interventions, as well as innovation on public-private partnerships. There is important opportunity for green finance to contribute to meeting this gap. The most recent Global Green Finance Index data of 2021 shows that overall policy and regulatory frameworks represent the most important driver to green finance. Regulatory reforms that green the investment market are crucial. Finally, engaging with a broad array of sustainable financing market will be key. For example, only 5% of SDG bond issuance goes to agriculture, fisheries, and forestry. This doesn't make any sense. We need to leverage the fundamental role of agriculture in enabling of the SDGs and can be a powerful tool for change. Financing to agri-food systems should be directed towards business models which are sustainable, inclusive, and resilient, and that promote healthy diets. Linking to green and sustainable finance solutions can be a powerful transformation tool, particularly to develop multi-sector, locally anchored strategies for more inclusive, sustainable outcomes. Transforming food systems, agri-food systems, requires combining the following strategies. First, mobilizing additional financial investments in agri-food systems, including greater public and private investments and blending finance with the conditions I have described before. Second, creating an enabling environment for unlocking finance and investment, including putting in place appropriate incentive structures and promoting de-risking or more effective risk management through inclusive knowledge, appropriate stakeholder capacities, conductive and effective policy making, and stronger partnerships. And here also agricultural insurance is crucial. Third, we need to reorient government expenditures for agriculture and food systems toward public goods and services, which will increase sustainability, efficiency, and equity, including repurposing of agricultural subsidies. Fourth, we need to promote green and sustainable inclusive finance, providing a diverse range of financial instruments, innovative instruments with innovative scoring systems to support small-scale actors living in situations of vulnerability. We cannot use traditional scoring systems in the case of agriculture. We need to innovate to ensure that the small-scale producers and SMEs have access to finance to achieve equitable transformation of agri-food systems, reducing inequalities in access. Finally, it is important to highlight that the pandemic has significantly increased poverty and especially inequality globally. And in Africa, this is enormous, the increase of inequalities, leading to a substantial reversal in the progress towards sustainable development goals. There is a high risk that these numbers will increase going forward as the war in Ukraine and soaring food prices are now facing us. Therefore, we need to take immediate steps in order to achieve high-performing and resilient agri-food systems to address this challenging context. And financing for development is central. And that implies financing agriculture, financing in a very competitive and inclusive way smallholders, and to take advantage of the green financing in a sector where green is essential. Thank you very much.
You told us a lot about the system overall. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you would see FAO's role, particularly in promoting additional finance for agri-food system transformation?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the complex question. So there are several ways in which FAO can play a role. FAO can play a role in scoring systems. We can test different mechanisms through which we can do scoring systems that are more appropriate for rural areas and for agricultural producers. The second role, which is really important, is on insurance. We are trying to develop an area on insurance, whether index insurance, but other traditional mechanisms of insurance. One of the major problems we face in developing and poor countries is the lack of information to estimate the loss, the potential loss, and therefore the reinsurance tools. And I think that's a huge area of work that we can accelerate, and we can help enormously, because linking insurance, as it was explained by Jennifer, to access to finance is essential. And there has been very good experiences on this, although still the pickup rate of index insurance is pretty low in Africa and in developing countries. I think there is a window of opportunity to do that, and that requires a lot of analytical work and technical assistance and involving reinsurance companies. FAO, as a member of all the countries that we operate, especially Swiss Re, for example, with Switzerland and so on, we can bring them together and start to working with us to try to help and minimize that market failure that we have right now because of the lack of information. Also, the other thing that is important for us is to try to start looking into green financing and trying to look into how we can incorporate into the real cost of food. And that's the topic of the SOFA of next year, is to how we can bring that concept into the idea of measuring those externalities, positive or negative, and how we can put a value to that so that we can start bringing potential green finance. And finally, I think it's really important in our case to try to see how we can work together with the bank and with other financial institutions like IFAD and with the team of Jennifer, but we need to figure out ways in which we can do blending finance through competitive process. That's extremely important, because what we want at the end is the minimum blending finance. And for that, private sector has to compete for it, and the financial institutions have to compete for it. We are accustomed to provide a flat type of blending finance, and that's not the ideal. Our job is to create the conditions and to create the parameters over which this should operate, but the private sector and the financing agencies are the ones that have to compete for that. And finally, information, data. We need data. Financing institutions need to have access to data of the flows, how these farmers are producing, what are the potential returns. Now, food commodities are very volatile because of climate shocks, because of man-made shocks like the ones we are facing. So the more information, the more transparency of information we can bring to the key financing agencies, the easier it is for them to try to do their scoring mechanisms and to try to give better access to finance. And this also includes how we can design innovation ways of contract farming arrangements where we also reduce the gender inequalities. We once tried to test, for example, with cash crops, how we can convince the buyers of sugarcane and so on and so forth, not to do only contracts with the male farmer, but to do contracts also with the female farmers. Those types of innovation and institutional designs could help enormously also to reduce the gender gap. Thank you.